All right, it's 10:01. If I were NPR, I would say it's 10:01 and the news is next, but it's 10:01 and Sally is next. So thanks everyone for joining us today. A special shout out to Bill Summers for helping connect us with Sally today. We are excited to follow up with some of the conversation we started last fall around building how creating bridges, sorry, how we can bridge divides and create a more inclusive workplace. Rising Together, you might recall, was the text that we offered to our members at our fall conference. Sally Helgesen has been cited in Forbes as the world's premier expert on women's leadership. She's an internationally best-selling author, speaker, and leadership coach. She has been inducted into the Thinkers 50 Hall of Fame, which honors those whose ideas have shaped the field of leadership worldwide, and has recently been ranked #1 in the field by Global Gurus. Her latest book offers practical ways to build more effective relationships with people we may perceive as different from ourselves. And it really connects to the work that we have been trying to do here at MASA to create those environments where everyone is welcome, everyone belongs, and feels like they're connected. Rising Together builds on Sally's remarkable success with How Women Rise, co-authored with legendary executive coach Marshall Goldsmith, which examines the behaviors most likely to get in the way of successful women as they move forward in their careers. Sally, we are so excited to welcome you here today and would just open it up to you with sharing a little bit about your work and some of the things that you're thinking about right now.
Certainly, Laurie. Well, thank you all, and thank you, Bill, as you've all connected me with so many different groups of people. It's wonderful working with Laurie and Deb. Dave Christian has been terrific in his support. So I'm very happy to have this opportunity to be here and speak with you. My work, I've been working in the field of leadership for 36 years now. Doing programs all around the world with all kinds of, associations, educational institutions, corporate law firm, accounting firms, governments. I was telling Laurie early, I'm going to be doing next week the Air Force Band at a joint base outside of DC. So it's been very, very rich, rewarding, and varied career and practice. And I try to learn something new every place I go. And what my focus has been is, always pretty much on two tracks, but they merge. One has been women's leadership. What is most helpful for women in terms of recognizing, not just recognizing, but also articulating and acting on their greatest strengths? What is helpful to them in recognizing the barriers that can hold them back? And this was the work, this is really, what I've been working on for decades, sort of culminating in How Women Rise, which has been really interesting because of it has been resonant in so many different cultures. I think that's what has astonished me. We've sold in 25 languages. I've got, anybody who's looking at me can see I've got my Mongolian edition up there, just primarily because I never thought I'd sell a Mongolian rights to a book. So it has been very, very resonant and has brought me around the world, both in person and virtually. And that has been fascinating because what I really see is it tends to be the same barriers that can hold women back in very different kinds of cultures. Now, the work with women has led me to focus on how we can build inclusive cultures. Writing a book called The Web of Inclusion, which was published in 1995 and was the first time the language of inclusion had been applied to the world of work. So that kind of got me early on the diversity and inclusion track because, who else was out there? Who else had written about inclusion? One person. So when diversity and inclusion became sort of joined at the hip, that work, had a forum in order to develop. But with Rising Together has been very interesting. That's the book I published in 2023. And I really wanted two things. First of all, what I learned from How Women Rise is that focusing on the how, the very tactical aspects of how people can do things, not just exhorting them to do things, but how they can do it in a very tactical way, was what made that book so, to use a term I heard used in our little chat before this got started. It made that book very sticky, made How Women Rise sticky, in that people felt it was immediately useful to them. So I wanted to do the same thing with inclusive cultures when I decided to write Rising Together. I wanted it to be very much focused on the how of inclusion, what gets in the way and what practices further it, what practices make it, what practices represent inclusion? How do we, as individuals, not just HR deciding on programs, but as individuals, what kind of practices uh, can can we use to help build that inclusive workplace and make people feel welcome? Now, when you're talking about an inclusive workplace, it always, and I know this because I've been dealing with it either through writing or speaking for, well, since Web of Inclusion, this is almost 30 years. Um, it can be kind of hard because the term by its very nature feels amorphous or vague. Inclusion, what does that mean? And especially as I talked about it as a web of inclusion, that's kind of doubly amorphous and vague. But what I've realized through the years is it's not at all. It can be very, very clearly defined as a culture in which people essentially feel welcome. How do we know this is true? And I'm asked this all the time. Leaders will say, "Well, we believe we're going a long way toward starting to build a more inclusive culture, but I'm not quite sure. How can I assess it? Is there an assessment tool we can use?" The assessment tool is listening to how people talk about your organization. If they talk about it in terms of we, you've got an inclusive organization. If they talk about it in terms of they, you don't. And that's a very, very simple way of judging. Another characteristic, I think, of an inclusive organization of any kind is that people feel, especially people who are outside the traditional leadership mainstream, who may have come from a different kind of tradition, they feel valued for their potential, not just their contributions. As we know from a lot of research that's been done, beginning, I think, with Catalyst in the mid '90s, that that people who are outside the mainstream, even when their contributions are recognized, they're not seen for their potential. And whereas the insiders are seen for their potential. So the more we see everyone's potential, and when I talk about diversity, yes, it's of course diversity related to gender, race, culture, ethnicity, excuse me, sexuality, all the age, all the demographics that are involved. But it's also diversity in terms of values and self-expression. So understanding, and I think we're seeing that with the broadening out in many organizations, recognition of different cognitive approaches as a form of diversity. I was writing about Mozilla, the big search engine organization. It's actually this search engine I use, Firefox, and they have a program where they have really benefited tremendously by hiring and working with to develop their skills and ability to contribute people who are on the spectrum and sometimes significantly on the spectrum of autism. or Asperger's, whatever we're calling it. But it's been really interesting, and it's paid tremendous benefits for them in terms of recruiting people who get bypassed by other organizations, and in a number of cases have developed significant product innovations for them. So this is where we live. I was very good friends with a writer in the 90s, Stanley Crouch. She was a kind of controversial African-American writer, and he used to say that American culture was about the constant redefinition of who gets to matter. And I see that process at work when we think about inclusion. Who gets to matter? That pool is constantly being broadened, and that's the good side of American culture as we know it. That broadening of that pool. So inclusive practices and are a big part of that. But I wanted to also look in writing Rising Together at what gets in the way, at what kind of triggers hold people back from creating, from building strong relationships that with people they feel are different from themselves. And these triggers can be, quite simple and obvious, like communication, like, I don't like how that person talks, or their voice bothers me, or they keep saying this, or, I hear people my age and younger than my age, oh, I can barely stand to talk to someone from Gen Z because they use this kind of language, they use that kind of language. So communication, they're small triggers generally. We generally have more, we find it easier to give people the benefit of our goodwill when it's a communication habit. Others are tougher. Fairness is a big one. People feel inhibited by resentful. That's not fair. Somebody said something, I didn't think that was fair. That person got promoted. I should have gotten that promotion. I did better on that last job I had. Those kinds of things. So those are real triggers, and they impact us. I identify 8 of them in the book, and talk about this. Want to focus on this a little bit, but I talk about some really good ways to address them that I've developed in some of the coaching I've done. But Lori, I saw some things coming in the chat, and I don't monitor the chat because it's distracting.
Yep.
But
I will keep an eye on that for you.
I wondered if there were questions, comments, ideas, anybody who's participating might have before move in and talk a little more about the triggers.
So let's open it up. Any comments, questions, observations for Sally before we talk about some of those triggers that we see? Gina's shaking her head. So if Gina doesn't have questions.
Is she the questioner?
She kind of is. She and I have been in some trainings together, and Gina asks questions, which was one of the many things I enjoy about her.
Well, I'll tell you, anybody who does what I do really enjoys the questioners. They're very important part of the whole process. I should have said at the beginning, sorry, I had a knee replacement. I have to sit in an awkward position and keep changing it. But I should have said at the beginning, to me, these programs work best when they're interactive. It's nothing less successful than me just sitting up here yammering on. So I really appreciate questions, comments, examples of your own experience. That's what makes these programs work. So I'm going to keep asking if there are questions. I thought from the chat, often people will put something in the chat. That's
yep, and I can keep an eye on that for you.
Yeah. Okay.
I know you mentioned triggers that might be interesting to talk about. I also know in your book you talk a lot about new ways of being, like how can we behave and respond differently? So maybe those are some things you'd like to talk about.
Certainly. And let's take a specific example. which would be fairness, when we feel triggered by fairness. And this is one of the most hyperactive triggers in the workplace, the feeling that something that happened was not fair, that someone who did something that we don't like or don't respect, that person was privileged over us. They got away with something, or they got promoted to something, or they didn't have to do as much work as we did. This is just human nature. It doesn't mean we're a bad person, and or a jealous person. It just means that there are many things that happen in the workplace that can feel profoundly unfair. The issue is that when we get focused on that, it doesn't tend to serve us. What do we do when we perceive that something has happened in the workplace that is unfair? And this gets to the heart of inclusion. We often don't feel we have a channel for bringing it up. That's one thing. If that's true, we will tend to stew about it, ruminate about it, get upset about it. And we may be tempted to bond with other people, our own cohort or posse, who we feel may have had a similar experience or will give us a sympathetic listening. And so again, it's a human response, oh, can you believe what that jerk, I'm stunned they promoted him. There were 3 of us who had done, much better on that last project. That sort of commentary, it's very human. But the problem is it doesn't lead us anywhere. It doesn't give us a path to action other than feeling bad and bonding with people in what is sort of essentially a toxic or negative way. And it can keep that sort of process of network building stuck, because the networks we're building are often, networks that we're using to air our grievances. So it's not a positive approach, although it's a human one. And I've noticed this over the years a lot, when I've done small programs where there's a lot of, interaction and, I'm there in person, et cetera, that I'll get these questions about unfairness. I've experienced it myself, of course, in the workplace, and felt it very deeply and felt wounded by it. And I've listened to friends over the years and people that I know and people I work with, but I've also seen it among coachees, people I coach very regularly. And in trying to think of a more constructive, a more positive, and a more action-oriented way of addressing this, what I've come up with over the years, and that I use, again, in coaching and in peer coaching, because I do peer coaching with a couple people. They coach me, I coach them, because I'm independent, so I'm not going to go out and hire a wildly expensive coach. And what seems to work best is to be able to sort of rewrite the narrative in a way that gives the other person the benefit of our goodwill. And I say our goodwill very intentionally, rather than the benefit of the doubt, which is a phrase we usually use, which is there's sort of an implication of something that they must earn or that we're gratuitously giving them. But the benefit of our goodwill is a very positive way of thinking about doing this. I'm going to give the person the benefit of my goodwill. I am also going to look, there may be an alternative explanation for what just happened. I'm going to be open to that, because often we will decide that we know why a person got a job over us. Oh, we got the job. Yeah, it's the old boys network at work again. That's why I got the job and I didn't get it. Or, I hear it from men now. Well, of course she got the job. They're basically only promoting women around here. So whatever that is, oh yeah, African Americans are getting promoted into these positions. That's why I didn't get it. Oh, they only they really only, privilege white people here. Whatever the explanation, that's what we may go to, or we may just go to the explanation. Well, of course he got it. He's a showboat. He's always at every opportunity talking about how fabulous he is, or what he achieved, or how well his team was doing, or what his scores were for last year, whatever. So it's not just what I call the demographics. It's also behavioral. Yeah, he's sucks up all the room, air in the room. No trouble talking about how great he is. So those are the kinds of things that will set us off. And it's very helpful to look at what might be a different explanation for this. Take the classic example, because I work with a lot of women. So classic example, I almost never don't get a question, what should I do in a meeting when I say something and nobody responds? And then, some guy says pretty much the same thing 5 minutes later, and everybody goes, wow, what a good idea. And, what you interpret as what has just happened there, of course, is nobody can hear me. Everybody hears him, because they're oriented toward hearing something from a man. So what could be an alternate explanation? What could be a different, how might you tweak the narrative in order to give him and the others in the room the benefit of your goodwill? One thing might be, oh, he's repeating my idea because he agrees with it. He's repeating it to amplify it rather than he's repeating it to steal it, or nobody can hear me. So what you do, you're reframing it in a positive way. It may be true. It may not be true. You know what? It probably is not true, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that it provides, by reframing your narrative in that way, it provides you with a positive way to move forward. It provides you with something you can act on, which is a remarkably empowering thing to do for yourself if you think about it. So in that kind of case, you could go up if something like that happened. And I'm really just taking sort of the simplest, dumbest, most obvious example here. But you can go up to that person as this meeting is ending, or send them an email if the meeting was virtual, and saying, I'm so glad that you agreed with the point that I made. That was a very positive thing. Maybe we could, have a brainstorming session and come up with something so that we could make this happen here. So, already, look, you've lost ownership, exclusive ownership of that idea already by that other person repeating it. That's fine. What you want to do is just make sure you can act on it. You can do something that is going to be constructive, and that gives you a path. It gives you also a path to potentially building some kind of allyship relationship with the person who you felt was trying to undermine you or was disrespectful. Now, if it keeps happening over and over, then you can probably recognize that your initial narrative was right. But an attitude of kind of curiosity, I wonder if there's an alternate explanation. On its face, it seems pretty obvious to me that this is what happened, but maybe it didn't. Let me test that out. Let me see if there's a way that I can use what just happened to take a positive step forward. And let me see if I can use what just happened to build a new kind of ally that could be useful to me in the future, could be useful to this other person in the future, could be useful to our team, whatever that entity is. So that's a very helpful thing to do. And I've had luck with it. A lot of people I've coached have had luck with it. The usual response as I get for pushback are, but I don't believe there is an alternate explanation. I believe that I've been in this job a long time, and I believe what that person tried to do to me was X. Okay, that's fine. If you can think of a way to make that a positive, if you can think of a way to take action on that, have at it. But if you can't, then try something else. It doesn't really matter there. And I'm not being a post-truther, but it doesn't really matter what the actual truth or motivation was. What matters is you're being able to move forward in a positive way for yourself rather than getting stuck. And this is, from what I've seen, one of the most useful things you can do. The other thing I get, the other pushback I hear a lot, and this is because we've all been very encouraged to be completely authentic, which I think has some downsides. I mean, I get it. There are a lot of people who are repressing who they were in the workplace. They felt that they couldn't be their real selves in the workplace. And it's freedom and liberation to them to a certain extent to feel that they can speak their own truth. But I think there's been a tremendous emphasis on authenticity that privileges it sometimes over professionalism. So what I hear from people is, well, that's not authentic to me. I have to speak my authentic truth. Again, fine. If you can find a way to make that serve you, this is about what serves you. If you can find a way to make that serve you, have at it. But, try to also consider what will work for you going forward. And also, you don't want to get too dug into who you see yourself as being in the world, into a self-definition. All of us know we've changed. I mean, I can think back to something I would have thought even 10 years ago and really believed and maintained that I no longer think. So if we're growing human beings, we're always changing our minds a little bit. We're always evolving. So getting too dug into our own authenticity is often, an inhibiting or restraining force in terms of our moving forward. My colleague Marshall, who's very, Buddhist in his what's shaped his thinking, always says, let it go, let it go, let it go, let it go. Are you, I'll say, just get here an example. Marshall, one thing about me is that I really find that when I travel, and I'll say, Sally, are you genetically programmed to like, whatever it is, the seat that, I can only stand having a seat, with no other person sitting next to me. Are you genetically programmed? Was there something in, when you were born, was this manifested? Well, not really. I mean, I've been traveling a lot and, and he says, so you can say, up until today, I found that I was very resistant to seats on an airplane that X. This is a whole new day. It's a whole new me. I'm open to what happens. And I think it's a really powerful kind of way of approaching things. We are constantly changing. And when we tell our story, see, that's a narrative I have about myself. I can only fly under certain circumstances. And it's very freeing to let a narrative like that go, to say, well, yeah, that's been my experience in the past, but, we'll see what happens in the future. So it's a good, that narrative reframing also helps us question our own, places where we may be dug in terms of what we think we're important. So I think it's very, very useful to sort of just reframe it, try it, test it out, see what happens. see what happens if you have a slightly different response, and especially for things that are related to uh, to communication, to fairness, to what makes us comfortable, um, to what makes us comfortable. We all have things we're uncomfortable. We all have stories we tell about, something that we're not that comfortable with. If we give the person the benefit of our goodwill, then we begin to see that person in more human terms. I'll give you myself as an example. I always had a kind of aversion to people, with neck tattoos, really. It's sort of, really? You were just released from state prison? Is that the statement you're trying to make? Well, that was my thing. Um, and this young lady who lives near me came out one day, and she all decked out up here. So I just thought, okay, here's an opportunity for me to call myself on my own, resistance to this. And I went up to her and I said, hi, I forgot your dog's name. I'm so sorry. So we started having a conversation based on that about her dog. And I just forced myself to sit there okay, yeah, she's got a neck tattoo. I don't care. It's not my business. Just keep going on. Look her in the eyes. Connect with her as another human being. Think of her as just another human being. And it was kind of magical, actually. And I felt that because I had, to some degree, really engaged my heart by giving her the benefit of my goodwill, that I was able to stand with her, to have a great conversation with her that made me feel very different about people who had neck tattoos. It's still nothing, that I would choose. And if my nephew came to me and said he was getting them, I'd probably say, think about it. But it just helped me. It freed me from that particular story I had about myself. And a lot of the stories we tell ourselves in the workplace, oh, well, that person has the right connections. I don't have the right connections. Or, well, that person hasn't worked very hard to have the right connections. So there's not much I can do about it. I have put in the labor to have those right connections, whichever side of the spectrum we're coming from. Very positive ways to address that. Comments, stories, experiences people want to share there?
I saw some heads nodding, Sally. Feel free, as those questions pop up, to put them in the chat, and we can let Sally finish her thought and still respond to those. Sally, one of my wonderments for you was around talking about kind of power within an organization. I know in your text you talked about essential powers and kind of how they interact, how they work. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Certainly. Glad to talk about it because it relates very much to, what we do when we build an inclusive culture. Now, this is partly an individual level, but also it's partly on the organizational or team level. So one thing I learned early in my career I was doing the case studies, in fact, on the web of inclusion. So this would have been, book was published in 95. So this would have been probably around 93, maybe early 94. I was doing case studies, and one of them was of Intel Corporation. And it was a really fascinating culture, just a clear part. It played a very clear role in the whole development of the digital industry out in Silicon Valley. So I was I was trying to get a sense of the culture. What I was fascinated by at Intel was that this was a company that had the capacity and it had a very strong charismatic leader, and aspects of the culture were sort of top down. But it was a culture that was very skilled at getting really strategic, innovative ideas from people at every level, rather than restricting that strategic part just to people at the top. It was very good at doing that. And I was fascinated by it. It was a particular instance where, you know, they really basically reconfigured who the customer was for Intel, making it the computer buyer rather than the equipment manufacturer, to solve a certain problem. And that idea came from a small marketing team in Denver that came up with this whole thing, which resulted in Intel Inside, et cetera. So when I was out spending time at Intel, people kept saying, oh, you need to talk to Ted Jenkins, you need to talk to Ted Jenkins. And he was an engineer, and he had been 6th hire at Intel. So he, you know, was sort of the company historian and the keeper of the history, the keeper of the tradition, the keeper of the culture. And most organizations do, in fact, have somebody like this. And it's often somebody whose, you know, positional power is not reflected in that aspect. So I talked to Tad, and the first question I asked him was, why is Intel so good at getting these kinds of big picture ideas from people who, when you look at who they are and the org chart, you would never think of them as having the power to put these big ideas out there? And he said, we can do that because Intel is a company that recognizes there are 4 kinds of power in every organization, and they're all essential. There is the power of connections, how many connections someone has, how many people in the organization they know, how many, and that helps them to get resources to flow. There is the power of expertise, you know, people who have deep knowledge and deep expertise. It may not be reflected in their position at all, but they are so skilled at their area, at the job they do. So the power of expertise, very, very important. There's the power of personal authority. And that personal authority is kind of a kind of charisma, where someone is respected for their ethics and for their ability to be a straight shooter. It could be, there are various things, but that personal authority is like, well, let's ask so-and-so because he or she has often had good ideas on how to do this. And again, the power of personal authority is vested in you as a human being. And it's you take it with you as you move in your career. It's not just something that belongs to the company. So that personal authority is very, very powerful. And we've all, I think, worked in organizations where someone who had very little positional power had tremendous personal authority. You know, in education, it could be a particular teacher who was not, you know, on the ranks or in any kind of leadership position, but was just known as someone who you could go to for thoughts and advice. And he said, and then there is the power of position, and that's a significant kind of power of, you know, the power of position, where you stand in the hierarchy or however you are configured, the organization is configured. So connections, expertise, personal authority, and positional power. He said, we also recognize that the organizations that are completely unable to use ideas from everywhere, from everybody, and turn them into strategic advantages are organizations that really overprivilege positional power. Because when you have overvaluing of positional power, then resources get stuck, relationships that could flourish and bring value do not, and expertise over time, people are not as avid about developing their expertise because they don't feel that they have any real input. So I have found that one of the most useful, his definition or his analysis of the 4 kinds of power in an organization. I found it one of the most useful things I've ever heard in all these many, many decades of interviewing people and talking to them about this, about these issues, is how that plays out. And I think that in terms of inclusion, it's also very, very important, because an inclusive culture is a culture that recognizes all those kinds of powers, rather than, again, privileging the power of position. So very important to ask yourself, is the culture I'm part of, is it one that does not overexalt positional power? And if it's not, if it's one in which positional power is overexalted or seen to be privileged over all the other ones, then how can we go about changing that? How can we go about realigning how power is perceived and distributed in this organization? So it's a key question to creating these cultures of belonging, because when you have positional power, the only kind of power that's really recognized or valued, then you don't create a culture in which people really feel they belong.
Thoughts from our group?
Sally, what I hear you saying is the importance of self-talk. We have to talk ourselves into different frameworks, different ways of thinking, and we have to muster courage. I know sometimes it's hard to muster courage, especially when you don't have that positional power, and you don't feel like you have the influence necessary. I see oftentimes some of our leaders who seek new positions and get turned down, have a hard time mustering up that courage and positive self-talk to continue to try to advance their careers, for example. Could you talk a little bit more about self-talk and mustering courage and being brave?
Exactly. And those are key things. And they can be very difficult, and structures can just discourage those. But I think that the most important thing in terms of having that, being able to have that, maintain a positive conversation internally with ourselves, is that doing that is very difficult to do alone. And where we all need the support of colleagues, of friends, of supporters, we need to develop that personal. I think it was Linda Hill at Harvard distinguished, the importance of thinking about what is my personal network, the people who are close to me, who make my daily life possible. What is my tactical network, the people who in my workplace make things flow and get resources moving along. And what is my strategic network? What is the network that I have of people who are invested in my own development and my career, and I'm invested in theirs? And this goes, in a way, to the heart of rising together, because this stuff is very hard. It takes a lot of courage. And if we do it alone, I mean, we can do it alone a few times, but consistently over time, in order to create environments that enable us to make our best contribution, we need support. This has become, of course, particularly difficult since the pandemic, since so many of us are home, or we're, not actually seeing other human beings, or we're interacting part of our team is virtual, got hybrid and everything's going on. So it's very difficult. It was always difficult to do this, but I would say it's become more difficult as we've moved to a more hybrid forms of some kinds of work. But it is essential, because whereas we can screw up our courage and grit our teeth and say, this time I'm going to let them know this fact, which I believe is of great importance that we're overlooking. And, those in positional power may not value it. And I'm going to be able to need to speak about it articulately. I'm going to be able to need to pick a good time to talk about it. I'm going to have to find a way to talk about it that is an opening of a conversation and not a declaration. How can I best do that? We may be able to do that ourselves with no support a couple times, but doing it consistently, which is what people do who make a difference to the culture, that's going to be very, very hard. And one of my observations, I've been watching people who've had very fulfilling, somewhat fulfilling, and quite frustrating careers in every possible sector. I've been watching that up close, interviewing those people, learning about what worked for them and what didn't work for them. Now, I say 35 years in this field, but I was doing, interviews for other aspects of work I was doing in corporate communications, for example, and journalism for 50 years. So I've heard a lot. And that's the main thing that has stood out to me, is that people who are good at making change are very good at recognizing that they need support, at finding people to run things by. I'm thinking that I thought that was a really interesting conversation we were just having, but I'm thinking that that this may have gotten left out. And I would like to find a way to raise this suggestion to X, Y, and Z, decision makers that matter. I'm sort of intimidated about doing it. I feel like it's taking a risk. I'd love to have some thoughts about how I can do this in a way that makes it most likely that it will be heard, that it will be considered, and that people will see that it actually would be a very good thing for them if they supported this. Because guess what? People who are in decision-making situations are always, to some degree, looking, how is this going to serve me? So when we can phrase it in that kind of way, like, it looks like you haven't even considered X, that rarely works, I know I've experienced you as a very thoughtful person. So I'm just play acting here. I know I've experienced you as a very thoughtful person, and I think it might be useful in given X, Y, and Z, if in this new initiative, we might be able to also do X. Couple reasons I think it could be useful from your perspective are, so that, that framing of your perspective, doing that kind of thing and doing it regularly really benefits from having people we can ask, how best might I do this? What kind of timing would you recommend? Is there something I should know about what this leader is trying to do that will make it more likely that they will be able to hear it or take it into consideration? So all of that requires support. So I think that the most important thing for everybody is to be concerned with, building those allies who can give us support. And especially if we see something that we feel could be done differently, could be done more effectively, could be done more humanely, could be done, in just a better way. If we have those kinds of interventions, doing that alone, it gets very hard. So that's an important thing, and getting loose about it. I call this process sort of informal enlistment, and it's very much adapted from Marshall's stakeholder-centered coaching, which is much more formal process. But I think we can, learn from that just in terms of enlisting people. I'm trying to get better at this. Do you have any thoughts for me? Or I've noticed I'm in a position where I have an idea that I want to share at the leadership level, and I'm concerned to do it. And I've noticed that you seem to have an ability to be quite diplomatic in a way that's very effective without, losing your ground. Is there anything you do, any way you prepare that you think could be helpful to me? That kind of thing. Then you've got someone who's got your back, who understands what you're trying to do, who may have some very good ideas for you, who may have some things that, that you haven't thought through. It's just a very effective kind of practice to get into, is engaging other people specifically, to get not just a generalized, can I have your support, but I'm determined to do this. So what might be some pitfalls that I'm not seeing, that I, and do you have any thoughts for how to address them? So getting people actively involved with what you're trying to do, very, very effective. You feel more supported. You have more ideas. You're letting people know that you're taking, that you're exerting a certain kind of power that may not be related to your position, but you're putting yourself out there as someone who is trying to represent a certain point of view. And everybody I know who's been able to make some significant changes has taken some variation of this approach, rather than I'm the one who has to do this, taking it all on our own shoulders.
Sally, there was a question in the chat as you started talking about your networks. There was a tactical network, a strategic network, and I think the third was actually the first that you said. And what did you call that?
The personal network.
Personal network.
It's okay. Actually from Linda Hill. She's she writes a lot about this, and I think it was a piece she did in the Harvard Business Review years ago. She's really, really brilliant thinker. And and she talks about that, distinguishing those and having an awareness, because, and I'd say, the personal network is more obvious. That's family, friends, neighbors, the person you can call if your car breaks down and you need someone to drive you to a place you have to be, all that. So that's, your babysitter, whoever is involved there, that's your personal. But I think that it's really also very helpful to think in terms of tactical and strategic, in terms of your work. Like, who the tactical is kind of obvious. That's the people I work with. But the strategic is the people who are, I can use and be a resource to in return for the bigger picture of what I want to contribute to this organization, to my community, to whatever entity it is, to the world. What do we want to contribute? Who can support us in that larger contribution that we would like to be able to make? And it's not necessarily positional at all. It could be positional. I seek to, expand my leadership of this or whatever. But it can also not be positional. It can be, my goal to make a certain thing happen in the world. My sort of desire for my own contribution personally would be to help women, recognize, articulate, and act on, as I said earlier, their greatest strengths, identify the barriers that may hold them back, and use that as a resource for building more inclusive cultures in which the largest possible number of people can thrive. That's what I want to contribute to the world. That's what I've been working for these many decades. Having a clear sense of that helps me understand who could be strategic sort of allies
Mhm.
to help me do that. To help me do that in a way that's, you know, ultimately doable for one person. That's not going to be on me. So very, very useful, I think, way of distinguishing, you know, how we build our relationships.
Wonderful. Any other questions from the group as we wrap up our time with Sally?
Goodness, it's what time is it? I'm just.
It is.
Okay.
You are a quiet group today.
You know, it's really been a wonderful. We were just having a sort of free floating conversation here, and there's so much specificity in both How Women Rise and Rising Together. I think that's one of the things that links them. Just a minute background with Rising Together. I mean, How Women Rise will keep my work going for probably 10 more years. It's so popular. I always say it's like, you know, some women sleep with it under their pillow, but it's very, very popular. So, but I was at an event I was doing, and it was a huge construction conference in Las Vegas a number of years ago. And, you know, I thought I'd write another book, but I didn't know what it was. I mean, it's kind of what I do, but I was doing a women's leadership program, and the people who put it together said, you know, expect, you know, maybe 150 women, you know, in the construction industry who don't feel seen and valued. Okay, fine, I can do that. And I got there, and it was about 2/3 men. I've never been so surprised in my life to see all these men. And what I prepared was completely wrong. So I said, you know, why are you here? What inspired you to come? And this one, you know, it was like, you know, what I knew it would be like, we're having a terrible time retaining talented women. They're leaving. We're doing something wrong. We need to know what we're doing. And then this one executive stood up and he said, you know, please don't waste your time, meaning also their time, telling us why we need to get better at doing this. We get it. We understand. We have no idea how to do it. None. And that's what inspired me to write Rising Together. I wanted to give very, very tactical ideas about how to do it, rather than focusing just on attitude, on unconscious bias, which has been a lot of the approach to diversity and inclusion, equity and inclusion. So I wanted it to be very tactical and how. I don't think we haven't really gotten into that much in this session. What these behaviors are that are most likely to create an inclusive culture, but hopefully people will read the book and get some good ideas.
Wonderful. Well, we thank you so much for your time, Sally. Ariana is giving a shout out. I think she was the biggest nodder when you were talking about sleeping with a book under your pillow, at least on my screen. So we just really appreciate your time and your thoughts and the connection that Dr. Summers brought to us so that we could listen to you in this small group today. So thank you so much for your time. Dave did put a couple things in the chat. I put a link in there to Bill's Learning Omnivore website. I'd encourage you to check that out, and just wish you a great rest of your day. And Sally, safe travels.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Lori. Thank you.